Why has Huck Finn, the story of a kid escaping down the Mississippi River, why has that story been so enduring? There's a famous quote from Hemingway, and he said that all modern American literature comes from one book, and that's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And that's fascinating because Mark Twain was writing a popular book, right? He has a quote that the great books are like wine, my books are like water, but everybody drinks water, right? So it's as if you could flash forward 130 years and Gone Girl, right, had become the basis of all, from the century, looking back over a century, Gone Girl had been the basis for all American literature. It's a strange situation. So I think there are lots and lots of reasons why Huck Finn has been so enduring. One that I'm sure most of you are familiar with is controversy. Controversy never hurts. And obviously, you've probably all heard the controversies in modern times about the teaching of Huck Finn. Twain is portraying characters from the 19th century. He's portraying racist characters. He's portraying characters like Huck, who are growing up with racist language, and they're using that language, and that is problematic today. But there was actually a controversy that came before that. When the book came out in the late 1880s, there were many people who banned the book. The Concord Library banned the book because the librarians didn't think that Huck spoke properly, that Mark Twain wasn't writing in proper English, and they didn't like the fact that he used this uneducated dialect, and that books were meant to teach people to speak properly. Now, there were many people back then who loved the book, and so that controversy is one reason that Huck Finn has been so enduring. So another reason, I think, is Huck's voice. Not just the controversy about it, but we know that voice. It's an iconic voice. You don't know about me without you've read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. But that ain't no matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth mainly. There was some things that he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. And we all know that voice, right? It's an iconic voice, and I'm not the first person to say this, but several people have said that Mark Twain was the first American writer trying to write American literature, right? In many ways, the people who came before Twain were trying to write English literature. And Twain makes a point at the beginning of the book there's an author's note, and he says, all of the voices in this book are authentic American dialects. And of course that's true. Huck Finn speaks more like a regular uneducated boy from the Midwest than would a typical literary narrator who came before. But there's another sense in which I don't think that's true. Huck's voice isn't that realistic. Huck's voice is a stylized voice, right? That's a voice we recognize. It's a stylized literary voice that draws inspiration from a real dialect. And Twain is having a lot of fun with that voice, and you can see the influence of Huck Finn and this stylized voice. You can see that in the literature of the 20th century and even the 21st century. And so I think that's another reason why the book's been so enduring. Third reason, obviously Twain was writing 20 years after the end of the Civil War, 20 years after the assassination of Lincoln, and he's addressing slavery, this huge issue that divided the country. He's addressing it straight on within the context of an adventure book, and he's got lots of satire in the book. It's a humor book, and so he's helping, I think, the nation process the sin of slavery. And so I think that's another reason why it's so central to our story as Americans. But I want to say that there's one other reason that we don't talk about very often that Huck Finn is so enduring, and that is that Huck Finn is a myth. So a myth, not a myth in the meaning in the meaning that it's untrue, but a myth in the sense of it's a story that we tell ourselves as a society about who we are and about what's important to us and about how to live in the world. So if there are any writers in the audience, you'll be familiar with this book. Joseph Campbell wrote many books. He was a professor of literature, but he studied myth around the world. And he came up with this theory of the monomyth. And so he was studying myths around the world, stories, some of them religious, some of them folk tales, and he was finding common themes. And his theories really influenced George Lucas in the writing of Star Wars. So he's been very, very influential in Hollywood and in storytelling in general. So I want to come back. We'll come back to Joseph Campbell in a minute. There are certain common themes in myths, and I want to come back to those in the context of Huck Finn. But I have another way that you can recognize you're dealing with a myth is that myths are retold over and over and over and over in different contexts. So, as you know, Huck Finn has been retold many times. I'm not the first to do it. Whoops. Yeah, here we go. So these are 4 books that have come out in just the past maybe decade, all riffs on Huckleberry Finn. American writers are constantly reworking this story. This one came out just a couple years ago about kind of a time, science fiction in a way, looking into the future at a time where Muslims are interned in camps, and a young girl from Missouri helps a young Muslim man escape from the camp. That was a controversial book. This one's about Huck's father. This is Huck Finn traveling through time. And then, of course, Hollywood tells this story over and over. Here you can see Huckleberry Finn. That's Mickey Rooney, Ron Howard, Elijah Wood. So every generation of Hollywood actors gets their shot at Huck Finn. And it actually gets remade all over the world every couple years. But I actually want to make a broader claim here about Huck Finn as an American myth. Let's look at some other recent movies. Anyone remember this movie? Beasts of the Southern Wild. A young girl on a raft with an adult, her dad. He's abusive. A lot of the themes of Huck Finn involved in this story. This is an older one. Some of you may know this one, some may not. This is a movie from the 1950s called Night of the Hunter, the only movie ever directed by the actor Charles Laughton. It's a gorgeous movie, and it's about an evil preacher, played by Robert Mitchum, very creepily, and he's chasing these 2 kids. He thinks they have some money, and in fact they do. They don't know they have the money, but they do have it. And he kills their mother, and he chases them down the river. And if you really want to read my book, look for 2 inspirations: Huckleberry Finn and Night of the Hunter. The wonderful thing about Night of the Hunter is it's sort of a mixture of an adventure and a horror movie and a pastoral, because there are kind of moments of pastoral beauty in their flight down the river. And those are 2 young kids, a brother and a sister. This movie, The Defiant Ones, a white prisoner, a black prisoner, escape together, and they start out with quite a bit of tension between them and kind of learn mutual respect. Rain Man, right? Tom Cruise traveling with his autistic brother, long-lost autistic brother. Thelma and Louise. True Romance, The Prostitute and the Nerd. The Free Spirit, this is another one of my favorite movies, Something Wild from the 80s. The Free Spirit and the Square Businessman go on a road trip. How about this one? Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. If you want a little bit of a mind trip, read Joseph Campbell in early December and then watch Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I wanted to find a picture with him on the iceberg floating away. The iceberg's kind of a raft, and he's floating away with Hermie, the elf, the aspiring dentist. There are a lot of Campbellian mythic elements in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. So here, there's a very complicated diagram of sort of the elements of the monomyth. I just want to call a couple things out. So usually, what I want to do is talk a little bit about Huck Finn, a couple of elements of Huck Finn in the context of this monomyth. So it's sort of a full circle. The story goes full circle, and the hero starts here in the ordinary world, and there's some sort of call to adventure. The hero, usually with the help of a friend or a mentor, decides to leave the ordinary world and go to a special world, often descending into the abyss or into the underworld. The Greek and Roman myths are full of heroes descending into the underworld for some sort of adventure and then re-emerging. Eventually, you go through a road of trials. Lots of different things can happen on the road of trials, and all of these things don't happen in every myth, but you can find every one of these elements you can find in many, many myths from around the world, any continent, very common themes. And then in the end, the hero returns to the ordinary world, now possessing some of the knowledge from the underworld, and experiences a resurrection of sorts, and is able to come back to the world and is a new person. So let's talk about the original Huck Finn in the context of the monomyth. So this is one of E.W. Kemble's original illustrations from the first edition of Huck Finn. And this is, so in the book, Huck is adopted out to the widow Douglas and Miss Watson. His father, the vengeful drunk, the psychotic drunk, shows up, kidnaps Huck, and takes him to a shack out in the woods where he holds him hostage. Now Huck eventually figures out, his dad's got to go out and get food and stuff, so he locks Huck in there, and Huck eventually finds a way out. How does he find a way out of the shack? He descends, he cuts a hole in the floor, and he goes under the floor. And what does he do? He gets a pig, he finds a pig, he shoots the pig, and he slaughters the pig with an axe, and then takes the carcass back into the shack and drags it around to make it look like he's been killed, right? He doesn't want his dad to chase him down the river, so he slaughters this pig. And so you can see Joseph Campbell would have a field day. I can't find any evidence that Joseph Campbell actually looked at Huck Finn, but think of that. Huck Finn has to slaughter himself in a sense. He has to kill his old self before he can go on this adventure into the underworld and come back his new self. So here's a scene. You guys probably know this movie, Shawshank Redemption. What happens at the end of Shawshank Redemption? Andy crawls through a sewage pipe. He's emerging from the underworld triumphant, and he's re-entering regular life, newly empowered with what he learned in the underworld. So I'm going to show you. So this is Daniel's illustration from our book. When Miguel and Huck go on the run, Miguel fears that he's going to be falsely accused of murder. He's an undocumented immigrant. And so they go on the run. Miguel very reluctantly accepts Huck as a co-traveler. Huck basically refuses to be left behind. And where do they go? They crawl down a drainage pipe, and it leads them down to the river. So what we were trying to do with this book, what I was trying to do with this book is tell this classic story, this myth, within modern day LA, within this amazing city that we all live in. And so you could argue that the LA River is one form of our underworld, right? It's a place where all of the roads go over the river. Lots of shady characters live down there, lots of people who are down in their luck. It's a place where the normal rules don't apply, and so it's the perfect place to function as sort of a mythic underworld in Los Angeles. And if you look, we'll go back. If you look closely at Huck Finn, if you wanted to look closely at Huck Finn and the things that happen to Huck and Jim as they go down the Mississippi, there's a lot of elements that you can find, right? The atonement with the father, it has a lot to do with Huck's father. He has an atonement of sense. He comes to peace with his father at the end of the book. There's certainly the road of trials, and they eventually end up back in polite society. So the river. I just want to share a few things. So to research the book, one of the things I did, our family lives fairly close to the river. We drive over it. I drive over it every week when I drop my daughter off at gymnastics. And so it's down there, and I'm familiar with it. I've kayaked portions of it. You can kayak portions of it, and I would encourage you guys to do that and to even walk down there or bike down there. I hiked or biked the full length. It's a 52-mile stretch. And in fact, the story starts up in Bell Canyon at one of the tributaries of the LA River, Bell Creek. And so for when I was researching the book, I did that full trip, either hiking or biking. And it's just it's a crazy place. And this is one spot out in the Sepulveda Basin where the river, there are portions of the river that are concrete, and they're kind of like a concrete ditch. Back in the 40s, the Army Corps of Engineers came in and tried to make the channel, the river flood safe, because there was a big flood in '38 where hundreds of people died. And so they wanted to channelize the river so that it could handle the amount of water that would come when there were big rainstorms. But there were a couple spots along the river that had underground springs. And so the concrete couldn't set, right? So there are still a couple areas of river that are what's called soft bottom portions of the river, right? And so this is out in the Sepulveda Basin, right where it changes from all concrete. This is looking kind of southeast, and it's just a creepy place because it's the place where there's vegetation. So when there's a rainstorm, all the trash gets carried from the streets, gets carried into the river. It comes rushing down here, and because it's vegetation, all the trash gets caught in the trees. And so it's just sort of, it gives it this, obviously from an environmental standpoint, that's not ideal. But from the point of view of a kid, from the point of view aesthetically, it's just a fascinating place because this trash is hanging from the trees. It just kind of makes for an eerie sight. Then there are other places in the valley, this is under a bridge. Forgive my photography. If you want professional photography, don't hire a writer. This is from the Sepulveda Dam, looking as the river emerges from the dam and starts winding its way toward Glendale. Another part of the river here with some vegetation. That's starting to be the Glendale Narrows, actually. The Glendale Narrows is kind of near Griffith Park on the other side of the 5. This is downtown. I think this is from the 6th Street Bridge, which no longer is standing, and which Daniel depicts beautifully in the book. This is down south of downtown. And then here's the Long Beach estuary. This is where the climax of the book happens. It's the third soft bottom portion. The second soft bottom portion is the Glendale Narrows, kind of running from Atwater Village to Elysian Valley. And then the third soft bottom portion of the river is down in the Long Beach estuary, where it dumps into the ocean, and the climax of our book happens down there. So one of the things I did after I wrote this book, I realized, hey, I've written this book about LA, and there's like Twain's original, there's some satire in the book, and Huck and Miguel meet all sorts of interesting characters along the way. And I thought, well, I've written this book about Los Angeles, and I really want to go and read some of these books about Los Angeles novels that I've never read before, that I've been hearing about. And so I started with Ask the Dust. Great book. If you haven't read Ask the Dust, just a wonderful book. I guess what I'm trying to say is reading these novels of great writers who've tried to process the city of Los Angeles through fiction. I just found it a really cool way to re-experience the city. And so also The Little Sister, love Raymond Chandler. Mark Haskell Smith, Carolyn C., and then Weetzie Bat's a really quirky little novel. You know, these books are dealing with a lot of the same themes about Los Angeles. The dark underworld, this population of vulnerable people who come here and who leave their families behind and who come here to seek their fortune. You know, this city attracts misfits and dreamers and people with delusions of grandeur, and that implies lots of great things and it implies lots of dangerous things. And so all of these books are dealing with that. All of these books, many of these books are also dealing with religion and spiritual awakening. I was hanging out with some folks from Fuller Seminary, and they said that at Fuller and in the community of divinity schools, there's a saying: if you want to plant a church, if you want to start a church, go to Los Angeles. And I heard that, and I was like, what do they mean by that? Because it's easy to think of our city as a secular city, but in reality, there's a strong tradition here of religious movements starting, the emerging churches that are blossoming around the city now. And there's actually one church that does a tour around town of all these significant Los Angeles sites that were significant in the rise of evangelicalism. Just anyway, fascinating. And then I just wanted to make a plug for Caitlin Flanagan, who's my favorite Los Angeles writer. She's not a novelist, but she writes for The Atlantic and just processes the city in a way that's really fun. And I would encourage you all to seek out her essay on the college admissions scandal, which is hilarious. So I'm going to turn it over to Daniel here. So anyway, just to come back to the myth, the monomyth. I wrote the book. I've read Joseph Campbell a long time ago. Those ideas are rumbling around in my subconscious, and he would argue that they were rumbling around in my subconscious long before I read his book. But when I came back to this recently, having written the book and having published the book, and I start to see, there's the theft of the elixir. There's a point in our book where Huck has to go seek out some anti-venom because Miguel's been bit by a snake, and he ends up having to steal it. I didn't know I was doing that. And there are some other things, so definitely recognize elements of the monomyth in what I wrote, even though I was not consciously trying to build those in. So a huge piece of this book, I really, as I said in the video, I really wanted this book to be illustrated, and trying to find the right person to do that and to depict that and to capture the mythic elements. I really wanted to find the right person, and so I felt so fortunate to be introduced to Daniel from a mutual friend who actually she isn't here today. She couldn't be here today, but lives very close to the library, and I wanted to find someone who had a personal connection to the LA River, who obviously did gorgeous art, and that we could do something that would riff on the original illustrations from Huck Finn and kind of take them to a new place and depict this mythic journey visually. And so I found that person in Daniel Gonzalez, and I wrote the book in 2016. Daniel and I worked together. He produced all of the art for the book in 2017, and just felt so fortunate to have found him. He was a great partner. He was fun to work with, and he was producing just incredibly gorgeous work over the course of that year. And so just feel so fortunate. I will never be able to see this book without Daniel's illustrations at this point, and I would really encourage you to check out his art, which is displayed right outside. His art from the book, and he's got some art, some of his other art too. So just feel so fortunate. And the final thing I'll say about this myth, you think about these myths. I think Huck Finn's going to be being retold over and over and over, probably for thousands of years. As long as there is something that we call the United States, I think we will be retelling Huck Finn. And if you think about the Roman Empire, we're still retelling the myths from the Roman Empire thousands of years later. So I think there's a good chance actually that Huck Finn will, and I'm actually, despite all the current noise, I'm actually quite optimistic about the long-term prospects for the United States of America. But there's a chance that Huck Finn will outlive our country as a mythic hero. So I'm going to turn it over now to Daniel to talk a little bit about the art and how he did it. Let me step back there. I'll step back there.
All right, we're just going to switch. Well, thank you everybody for being here, and thank you to Christine Reeder for having us here at the library, all the staff for making us feel very welcome today and very comfortable. And I think, well, the best way to explain the way that I make my art was actually the video, rather than asking you to imagine what it's like. Also, I'd like to invite you guys to come visit my studio. In the program in the back, there's one of the programs is an open house where you could come over and see the presses, and I'll have something set up. And you can see some of the other work that I produced outside of this project. But I have to say, like, I feel just as fortunate being part of this project. I grew up in LA, and I'm very lucky to still be living here. And I've always considered the city to be this great place to build stories and to build. Part of my work as an artist is building visual stories and making these visuals that are related to the environment that surrounds me. So to have the opportunity to work with Tim to illustrate his text was, for me, a dream come true. I get to tell this big story retold in the city that I love, in this setting of the LA River, which, has been kind of around me my whole life. I grew up in Boyle Heights. The river has always been like 2 blocks away from my house. And it's amazing. I was listening to you talk about Joseph Campbell, and there's a space, there's a tunnel that runs, and you have to be really brave to go through it. It's really long, and that's an access way to get into the river. I used to ride my bike down in through that tunnel, and at the end there's like a little light, but you have to like put up with, you don't know who's down there. The smell isn't that great. It's really bad. But if you could make it right through that tunnel, you'll end up at the bottom of the river, and your perspective is just shifted. Everything that used to be your horizon just gets shifted up. So now to look at the buildings, you're looking beyond like this concrete channel to look way up into the buildings, and your field of vision is just kind of like wiped out by the sun reflecting off the concrete, and then the sound of water. And then, when I used to go down there, was tons of graffiti, which I didn't mind. I thought it was kind of a record of what the people that came through. A lot of people look at it and say that it was gang affiliated, and they decided to wipe it down. I don't think people, when they did that, realized that they just wiped off like a whole history of the people that used to live there. There was graffiti down there from the 40s and 30s, from the Depression during the Depression era. So for me to get a chance to look at that, and also to incorporate small details about the river, for example, like the LA River Cats, which was a project that Leo Limon took on and started doing the sewer caps. I had the gentleman point them out earlier. He knew exactly that exit off Zoo Drive on the 5. You look into the river and you would see these sewer caps, and he would paint these faces of cats on top of the sewer caps because they had these little triangles, and naturally he would paint a face on it. The 6th Street Bridge, I got a chance to put that into a long landscape. I got through those images to record some of the landscapes that I loved, and normally, like anything, time marches on and they're fleeting, right? You take a picture, it's not going to be the same space as it was 5-10 years ago, because everything's changing. Things get built up, things get knocked down. But one of the things that made this project very successful is the way that Tim allowed for me to have the space to create these images, and he really took he was open to my commentary, and for me working elements into the images that maybe necessarily weren't there when he was writing the book. So for me as an illustrator, I'm just trying to fill in the gap between what you're reading and what your head is imagining, and just kind of give you a glimpse, right, of the story and the narrative, and hopefully entice you to turn the page and maybe find another illustration and read on. So, but that's all I have to say. I think I could just leave it at that. If you have any questions, I'll be here to answer them. But incredibly fortunate to be working on this project, and I'm very happy to see you all here today. Thank you.
Yeah, we're happy to do Q&A right here. One thing I want to say about Daniel's work, not every artist, obviously his work is beautiful, but not every artist has a sense of story, right? And Daniel, that was one thing that Daniel brought. We used his images to capture really big moments of drama and details of drama, but then Daniel was also able to capture these big cinematic moments, like the moment when fireworks are going off above the river as Huck and Miguel are floating by on the raft, and the fireworks are going off above them. That's a big cinematic moment, and Daniel just captured that gorgeously and gave the book its kind of cinematic feel, which I really, really valued. So anyway, we'll open it up to questions. Anybody have any questions for us? Go ahead.
Hey, what was your process of, and
Hey.
maybe this is how you do it, what was your process, maybe for both of you, but for Tim in particular, for finding an artist to work with? How did you go about that? How did you find artists? How were you going on studio visits, or were you like putting things out on, were you going to art schools? What were you doing?
Yeah, no magic there. I was doing web searches, and I posted on Facebook. And so I've actually found Daniel two different ways, almost simultaneously. I thought maybe I wanted a printmaker. I knew nothing about printmaking, but the original illustrations from Huck were prints, and so I think they were zinc etchings or something. I don't even know what that means, to be frank. Danny can probably talk about that. But I thought I wanted a printmaker, and then and so I was kind of looking online, and I found Daniel's work. And I talked to another couple artists, printmakers, but they weren't quite the right fit. They weren't quite as skilled as Daniel, for one thing. And then I found Daniel, and I was like, oh, how do I get a hold of this guy? And I was trying, and I had a couple false starts. And then I thought, oh, wait a second. And our mutual friend had posted him onto that Facebook message. And I just failed to follow up on that. Then I found him online. I figured out how to get a hold of him. So yeah, no magic.
And I'm easy to find.
It didn't seem like it at the time, but
Well, my phone number is up on my site, and you don't have to send a ninja assassin.
Fair enough.
Pretty accessible person.
Go ahead, Steve. Oh, so there is an Audible book. I will say I was surprised. I did that last fall. I read it myself, and I hired. It's a craft. Doing audiobooks is a craft, and LA is one of the centers of audiobooks in the world for the production of audiobooks, mainly because it's an actor's gig, right? And so there's so many actors here. So there's a little place out in the valley, and I hired a couple coaches to help me do it because I really had in mind how I wanted to do Huck's voice. And that was a third. I had a blast writing this book. I had a blast doing working with Daniel on the art. And then I had a great time doing that audiobook. It was such a pleasure. I rediscovered how much I love that book, how much I loved writing that book by trying to, get Huck's voice down and tell the story in a dramatic way. And I think you can probably get it. It's on all of the, you can rent it through Pasadena Public Library. You can loan out that audiobook. So I would encourage you guys to do that. I had a lot of fun doing that. You will miss out on Daniel's illustrations, so be sure to figure out, look at the hardcover book or look at them online. But that audiobook was a blast. Go ahead.
Daniel, what was your research process for the images that you did?
Oh, okay. So, what Tim didn't know when he hired me was I had spent 9 years working for the history division for the city of LA. So I was really well versed on the river. It wasn't just sentimental. I really had a lot of research done already, and even picking the animals. Most of it was from experience, but I wanted to have a really nice balance of reptiles and fish and mammals and birds. And I really wanted to represent the space well within the book. but there's like some, if you look at really closely at those illustrations, these are animals that don't live in pristine environments. There's like usually a little bit of pollution around them. If you look at the skunk, there's a gas can, like a graffiti spray can next to it. I thought that was kind of funny, like an aerosol can, because skunks spray. And but anyways, so I had already kind of an idea, but with the book, Tim would send me the excerpt, because as I was illustrating, he was doing the final edit of the book. So he would send me the excerpt, and then like he would send me photographs. He had an extensive photo library of the river, and then I would visit some parts of the river myself to kind of get a sense of what's there. So there's a really great scene of an owl overlooking the Sepulveda Dam. That's kind of like made up, but that's based off of an aerial photo that I found, and then I added the telephone pole, because in that scene there's an owl. So that was very important to show. But that's kind of like it's a kind of a collage of things that are there and things that aren't. Yeah, and then just thinking of it like kind of like as a movie still, right? Like it's funny. Like I did the illustration of the hippie with the shotgun, and I showed it to my friends who live out in Cathedral City over by Coachella. And I showed it to him, and he's like, "Dude, that's one of the guys that lives over in the desert, isn't it?" So it was very flattering to hear, people kind of like they look at the image, and I kind of captured something that made them, and they hit it right in the head. Like that's exactly what I was trying to show.
And Daniel just brought lots of little ideas to the book that I didn't think of, or big ideas. One example is the plaque. So the plaque that starts the video, the title plate, it's on the title page of the book. And Daniel just had the idea to have that be a riff on the plaques that are on the historic bridges along the river. And so I had never even noticed those plaques until Daniel showed me that illustration. And then now I'm driving along, the 110, and you see those plaques. I'm like, I get it. And it really, having somebody who loves LA, who is into history and who processes LA at a very high level visually was really helpful. And he took my crappy writer photographs. I gave him like thousands of photographs, like categorized by which section of the river, and I would tell him these scenes are happening here, and he would go dive into those crappy photographs and find, kind of some inspiration to make a dramatic scene. It was great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. We'll be outside if you want to chat. We love chatting with people about the book, so come take a look at the book, come take a look at Daniel's prints, and we're happy to talk about it. And thank you.